Oh, don't worry about me. I'm just waiting for... What's up, everybody, and welcome back to Sounds Good Makes Sense, a discussion show for the World of Warcraft player and MMO player in general. My name is Devilor, and today we're going to be talking a bit, once again, about the concept of should the timer be removed from Mythic Plus dungeons. Now, I know we've talked about this on the show a little bit in the past, but that was quite a while ago. A lot of things have happened since then, and a lot of new things have now come to light in recent days that make that topic worth revisiting a little bit. So we're going to look over, just in general, what are the positives of having a timer in Mythic Plus? What are the negatives of having a timer in Mythic Plus, and thus the reasons to consider removing it? What would the repercussions of that be in terms of player behavior if the timer was removed? If they move to a more death-based system like Delves instead? We're going to look at a lot of different angles. Plus, if that change were to take place, what would be some other things that need to take place and other changes that need to happen to make it worthwhile and to make things all work together? But first, before we get into that, I have a giveaway going on right now. The Siren Isle 11.0.7 patch just came out for World of Warcraft today, December 17th, if you're watching this on YouTube the day that it went live. And we're doing a giveaway. We'll be giving away 2 different copies of the Waveborn Diplomat's Regalia. That is a transmog set that you can have access to inside of World of Warcraft. The way that you will be able to get access to this is to go over into my Discord. You check out, there's a giveaway section. You just go in my Discord, discord.gg/Devilor. You scroll down on the left, pretty close to the top on the left, there's a giveaway section. You go in there and you click that little party icon to be able to enter into the giveaway. Now, that giveaway is only running from now, as I'm getting this thing together, until 9 p.m. Pacific on the 17th. So that'll be ending at 9 p.m. Pacific. That's basically midnight Eastern time. You will have until then to go over there and click that icon. And that's all you have to do to enter. Just click that thing. Join the Discord, click that thing, and then you are entered into the giveaway. There are 2 of these keys available, as I mentioned, and they are only accessible, at least I've been told, they are only accessible inside the Americas and Oceanic regions. So if you live in Europe or elsewhere, you're not going to be able to actually use these keys should you win one of them. But again, go over into the Discord. Again, that's discord.gg/Devilor. Click that little icon. You will have a chance to win one of the 2 keys that are available. And thank you so much, Blizzard, for providing me with those keys in celebration of this new patch that's just come out. And I will, of course, be checking out that patch live on my Twitch channel as well. That's twitch.tv/Devilor. Feel free to pop over, say hey, let me know what's going on. Let me know how you're enjoying the patch so far, and come along with me as I experience it for the first time, because I've managed to avoid a lot of spoilers about this patch, and I'm really interested to see what's going on and learn more about the ongoing story of the War Within. Anyway, let's get back to today's topic. The reason this is coming up is that, incidentally, as I was looking up just a little bit of information about patch 11.0.7, I was going over to Wowhead, and I saw that they had a couple days ago posted an article talking about how Blizzard is now sending out a survey to players that is asking them, do you want the Mythic Plus timer removed, among other things. But the thing that they focused on in the article on Wowhead was a question. Specifically, the question was, how interested would you be in Mythic Plus dungeons utilizing a death limit similar to Delves instead of a timer? So the idea of removing the timer, no longer having a time-based like win or lose to how you progress through a Mythic Plus dungeon and how you advance presumably then through the different tiers and different key levels and so on. No longer having that be timer-based, and instead have it be a deaths-based system like in Delves, where if you die too many times, then the run is over and you basically have to go again. And so I think it's worth really looking at it through that lens specifically. How exactly would this change, especially the way that player behavior tends to fall in place with a largely pug-based system for Mythic Plus dungeons these days? How would that change affect how people approach Mythic Plus dungeons? What are the reasons that timer is there right now? What are the reasons to get rid of that timer? What would changing to a deaths-based system, how would that affect the different ways that players approach Mythic Plus dungeons? And with all of that in mind, what are potentially some things that Blizzard could do to mitigate some of the negative effects of such a change while amplifying the positive effects? Let's start with why to remove the timer in the first place. There's a lot of people who, as soon as they hear, should they get rid of the timer in Mythic Plus, just immediately go, yes, get rid of the timer. I hate the timer. I don't want it to be there. And that's fair. That's valid. There's never, if you just don't like something about a video game, it's fine to just not like things about video games. That's perfectly okay. but let's dig into some of the reasons why that most commonly comes up. One of the biggest ones is genuinely just that a lot of people find timers to be stressful. If you're going through a Mythic Plus dungeon, even though the timers nowadays are pretty forgiving to be like it from an overall perspective, unless you're pushing really high keys, the timers are pretty forgiving these days. You can get through a Mythic Plus dungeon relatively confident that you'll be able to make it through on time, unless, like I said, you're pushing higher keys. Even in those dungeons, it's just there's the extra stress level of having that little timer in the corner of the screen just ticking down on you constantly and knowing like gotta go fast, gotta go fast, gotta go fast. And even if again, even if you're not actually at any risk of losing out on the timer, it can still be stressful for a lot of players. I get that. And that can be extra annoying in a few dungeons. The one that immediately comes to mind is City of Threads, where you have that whole section after the first boss, the like hide and seek section after the first boss, where you're running around all over the place and you're just trying to find the guys that you need to be killing. And yeah, once you get the patterns down, you get an understanding of where exactly they can be, it becomes pretty much second nature and you can breeze through it in a hurry. But it's still like, if you're someone who finds timers to be stressful, the fact that you're having to literally, it's not a question of how good are you at playing the video game. It's a question of, can you even find this guy in a reasonable amount of time so you can kill him and move on to the next one? I can understand why, especially in dungeons like that, someone would be like, the timer's stupid, just get rid of the timer, let me just do the dungeon. But I think there's more to it than just not liking timers. I think there's some real and serious behavioral elements and the way that you approach Mythic Plus dungeons that kind of change your approach to doing the content in the first place that a lot of people then don't like as a result of the timer existing in the first place. And the biggest like source of all of that is that inherent and pure focus on speed. It comes down to things like, does the tank know the best routes through the dungeon? Does everyone, if there's like a skip or something that like everyone does everyone actually know that inside your group? And because there's such a strong focus on speed specifically, it's very difficult in that environment to be able to teach anybody what's going on. Like I'm somebody who I would happily tell a tank where to go throughout a dungeon. If they're just like, hey guys, it's my first time in here, I don't really know the routes through this, can someone tell me how to get through this? I would happily do that, unless it's like a higher level key and I'm like, you should probably know this by now. And also like, we're going to fail this run if you don't know this stuff inherently already. It makes it difficult to actually teach them. Like maybe, like, I don't know, hypothetical environment, maybe they've normally done as DPS and they decided to switch to tank for this one because we were like, we just need a tank, we can't find one. I don't know. The hypothetical situations that can absolutely occur. But in a situation where everything is purely focused on getting through this dungeon as fast as possible, I can understand why that makes it difficult to try to teach people what they're supposed to be doing as they're going throughout the dungeon. And that's not just literally only about like tank routing and skips and so on. That can be things like, oh, have you not done this boss before? Or have you not learned how this mechanic works on this boss? By the time you find out that someone doesn't know how to kill a boss, you're kind of already too late half the time. There just isn't a good opportunity mid-run as you're realizing, oh, this is something that someone doesn't know. Even if you would like to share that information with them, it's difficult to do that mid-run without like stopping and pausing yourself. And because there's no way to pause in a Mythic Plus dungeon, because again, there's a timer going on, that makes it difficult to actually teach people. So that is one negative aspect of having the timer. The other thing that having that pure focus on speed results in is that it kind of makes DPS more important than anything else. And obviously that's always going to be the case if you're a pure DPS class. Like if you are, you know, an enhancement shaman, the amount of damage that you dish out is kind of the most important thing that you bring to the group. Obviously there's then utility on top of that, but the damage is kind of why you're there. But then that spreads over into tanks and healers as well, where now it comes down to like a lot of the best Mythic Plus healers in the past haven't been the best Mythic Plus healers because their healing is good. They've been the best Mythic Plus healers because their damage while also keeping the team alive is good. Same goes for tanks. The tanks that do the most damage while not dying, it doesn't matter if they not die just barely or not die like they're just living through absolutely everything. You can be an immortal tank, and if you're not doing very much damage going through a Mythic Plus dungeon, then you're kind of slowing the group down. And that especially again at higher keys, really becomes an important factor. And the biggest reason that this is important is because a lot of people decided they wanted to play tanks, decided they wanted to play healers because they wanted to tank or they wanted to heal, not because they wanted to DPS. This is something I especially hear from healers a lot of the time is healers saying, I just want to be able to support my team and keep my team alive and buff them and do all that sort of thing. I prefer the play style of I'll keep you guys alive so that you can do more damage. as opposed to I'm going to toss out a couple of heal over time spells here and there, and then be focusing on pumping as much damage, like my weak healer damage, pumping as much as that as I can in the meantime. It's a play style that is very different from what historically healing in an MMORPG, including World of Warcraft, has been like. Again, I get that complaint. And then, of course, there's always the question of what if something comes up? Like I mentioned earlier, you can't pause in one of these things. So what happens if someone's internet goes out? What happens if someone's like, I don't know, parent starts beating down their door or something? They really need to talk to them. What happens if you get a phone call? What happens if your cat starts puking on your feet? I wish I could say that was something that hasn't happened to me while doing Mythic Plus Dungeons, but I'd be lying. She's right there too. She's being very adorable and pretending that that's something she hasn't done. But what if something comes up? What if any of these random occurrences just throughout life being life occurs as you're trying to get through a Mythic Plus dungeon? And the answer is, unless you can resolve that within a few seconds, you probably are starting to, at the very least, creating a greater risk of losing out on that timer. And I'm sure there's other things I'm not thinking of as well, as I'm just sort of mentally going through this list of complaints about the timer existing in Mythic Plus Dungeon. There's a lot of reasons why someone might not want there to be a timer in their dungeon. Like it even goes back to things as simple as like before Legion, this is just what dungeons, well, I guess technically before Warlords of Draenor, our biggest challenge modes existed. But either way, actually there were challenge modes at Mists of Pandaria too, weren't they? I have that transmog set on my Warlock. Historical lessons aside, and forgetting which expansion things first occurred in, prior to Mythic Plus and sort of prior to challenge modes, going through a dungeon was going through a dungeon. It was like the goal was to complete it. It wasn't something to necessarily like try and do as fast as possible. There's always going to be some inherent need and desire for people to complete things quickly inside of an MMORPG, because the faster you get this dungeon run done, the faster you can do another one. But with less of an immediate, like in your face focus on that timer being the most important aspect of completing the dungeon, it allowed people to take things at a little bit more of their own pace and find groups that were more comfortable with doing things at their own pace. And I think a lot of players do genuinely miss that. It's how things work in Classic. That's something that a lot of people say is what they like about doing dungeons in Classic, is you just kind of do it. And you can be chatting with your party members. You can be chatting with your friends and your guildmates and so on while you're going through this thing, and not feel like it's distracting from anything that you're trying to do. All of these, I believe, are very valid reasons, and it's all things that are worth considering when looking at the concept of should we remove the timers from Mythic Plus. But not only do we have to think about this in terms of what negative behaviors is having the timer creating inside of Mythic Plus dungeons, but we also have to think about what negative behaviors is the timer preventing inside these dungeons. What is the reason that it's there in the first place, and what does having this timer mean that we don't experience as a result, and what are those potential negative things that would then come to light if the timer were removed? One major thing that the timer helps prevent in terms of like a quote unquote degenerate play style, which, quick aside, when we say things like degenerate play style, we're not calling players degenerates for going and playing in this specific way. It's more a term that means that this is an unintended way to approach this content that is typically done because it's effective, not really because it's fun. Right? Like it's something that we go, ugh, this play, we have accidentally encouraged players to do something that isn't really fun or interesting and is obviously like not intended. It just happens to be so effective at accomplishing this thing that it's worth doing even if you don't really want to. So that's what that means in terms of degenerate playstyle. And one of the big ones that would come to light if the Mythic Plus timer were removed is waiting around for cooldowns. If there's no timer in place, then there's really no reason to take any risks on a boss fight, in which case you might as well, if there's 5 minutes until Bloodlust comes off cooldown and you think that Bloodlust is going to make the difference between a kill and a wipe, you might as well just wait the 5 minutes and then go do the boss fight. It's just, especially in like hierarchies in content where it's actually becoming very difficult to down these bosses, it makes the most sense to just wait. And you're going to feel like any attempt where you do that, even if there was no death count system in place, you're still going to feel like any attempt where you don't have Bloodlust is going to be a waste of time. So you might as well do anything else for those 5 minutes and wait for Bloodlust to come off of cooldown. That is something that currently is not done because you don't want to waste time. You don't want to like, it's worth at least trying to kill the boss, even if it's going to take a little bit longer. versus if there was no timer in place and the overall amount of time that it takes you doesn't really matter, you're going to be more inclined and more incentivized to go after those safe kills where you know you're at least going to be able to kill the boss because you've got Bloodlust available. Same goes for any other cooldowns. Like, you're going to just spend more time coming up to a boss fight and going, okay, well, the shaman's earth elemental is going to be off of cooldown in 2 minutes, so we might as well wait for that to come up, and so on. It would definitely be something that would occur more regularly than it does currently. To put that a little bit more succinctly, I guess, if my chances of getting the reward that I'm after are increased by just waiting around, and there's no downside to just waiting around, then I'm just being stupid and impatient if I don't. Like, it's just the incorrect choice in that situation to not wait. And this is something we've seen in the past. This is behavior we've seen in the past in Torghast. This is one of the biggest reasons that the timer-ish stuff, the sort of ramping debuffs and so on, were added to Torghast back during the Shadowlands beta, was because it was becoming pretty clear that as you got higher and higher and higher in difficulty, it just made more and more and more sense for whoever was progressing through Torghast to just sit there and wait for their cooldowns to come off so that then they could pull the next pack, especially as they were starting to approach bosses or as they were starting to approach packs with elites in it and so on. We even saw a little bit of this in Delves, but we're going to come back to talking about Delves a little bit as we get later on in the episode. Another perk that the timer being there provides is that you have a pretty reasonable estimate of how long it's going to take you to do any of these dungeon runs. Like, if the timer expires at 30 to 35 minutes, I think 36 minutes is the longest timer on any of the current Mythic Plus dungeons that are available. If the timer expires at 36 minutes, you kind of figure, okay, this is a 40-minute thing at the latest. Like, if we miss the timer, we're not going to hang around for that much longer after that. And especially like if you know that this group looks like one that's capable of completing it in time, you have a pretty good estimate of how long that's going to be. If we get into the environment where, okay, well, we technically can complete this content if we get lucky, we just have to get lucky and have good pulls, then realistically that gets to the point where now this could be something that takes hours to get through. Like, it literally, ignore the concept of the death limit for a moment. If there was no timer and there was no death limit, then realistically you could be attempting the hardest possible Mythic Plus dungeons, and with infinite time you would eventually complete it, because it infinitely lengthy amount of time, you can just get lucky enough by dodging at the right time, by the attacks that the bosses do, by what happens you get lucky crits and so on. It is theoretically possible to be able to complete this stuff. So you probably will have groups that will just continue pushing that. However, the downside of that then is as you start to creep towards that level, and I'm not saying that we'll get to that level. I'm not saying that people would eventually be like, I'm going to go into this dungeon. If it takes me 12 hours, then it takes me 12 hours. It's more that delta of time becomes longer, where you, as you're going to those higher keys, you'll reach the point where this could be a 30-minute run, or it could be a 2-hour run to be able to complete it. And you'll be able to complete it. You feel confident still that you can do it. It's just a question of how long is the group actually willing to spend in there. And if there's no time limit, there's nothing that eventually just says, okay, you've been in here for too long, you're done now. Then there's more of a social blocker to you just saying, okay, this has been too long, I'm done. And where that actually falls for a lot of people is going to be at different places. So it's nice currently knowing that if I'm signing myself up for a Mythic Plus run, if I get that invite and the group fills up, from that moment where the group is filled up and we're all in the dungeon, we're getting started, it's probably only a half hour or so before I'm out of there. That's just one nice aspect of having the timer as it is currently. Now, again, you could easily make the argument that's how dungeons were before Mythic Plus, because it is. Like, you could sign up to an Uber's run back in the day, and it could take you 3 hours to get through Uber's, or it could take you 30 minutes, depending on the group that you got, depending on who was in there. It's just the amount of time was all over the place. But it's important to note that back in those days, dungeons weren't really forever content either. Like, that was something that you outgrew. Mythic Plus is something that when you outgrow one tier, there's another tier right above that, and then there's another tier right above that, and then there's another tier right above that, and you're getting better rewards. There is eventually a cap, but most of the time you're getting better and better and better rewards all the way up till the end. And even if you are a top end world first Mythic Raider, there's still reasons for you to be running Mythic Plus. It's not really something that you outgrow. anymore in terms of the advantages that it can bring to your character. So kind of a different environment, and as a whole, it was different back in the day where eventually this content, you just knew this was going to be easy at some point. That's not really the case these days. At those high levels of Mythic Plus, like it'll be easy for groups, but it's still the sort of thing that if you could push that even farther, you probably would. Of course, that's coming from the perspective of what if the content's just difficult and it takes us a while to get it down. The other side of that is, what if someone just goes AFK? What if there's no timer in place? What happens if someone just decides, you know, I'm going to go somewhere else for a little while? Like right now with the timer in place, if someone goes AFK in a Mythic Plus, you usually assume that it's probably because some sort of emergency occurred. Like something happened that they desperately had to take care of right then and there, because the vast majority of people who are signing up for Mythic Plus groups, they do want to successfully complete them. And they know that if they AFK in the middle of a run, they are less likely to actually complete that. And so their own personal incentive drops away. If there's no immediate penalty in a situation where there's no immediate penalty for going AFK in the middle of a dungeon, you're not strictly directly reducing your chances of completion if you go AFK in the middle of dungeon. Those concepts of what an emergency constitutes, that gets a lot more broad. It could be something as like, it goes from my house is on fire, I need to go put the house out right now so my house doesn't burn down into things like, oh dang, I ran out of snacks, I'm going to AFK for a minute and get right back. And especially because this is group content, one person AFKs, then another person AFKs, then another person AFKs. Then there's been 20 minutes of you just standing there while you wait for everyone to get back. That can be frustrating. And that's behavior that, again, probably wouldn't necessarily be super common, but would occur more regularly should a timer be removed. And remember, like, we're talking about modern Mythic Plus when we're looking at this. We're talking about most groups have at least one or two pugs in them. Obviously, there are many groups that are, it's like, this is my M plus crew and I only go with this crew, and we get together at these times and we go at blah, blah, blah. Like there are a lot of people that do have those tight knit crews, but the vast majority of Mythic Plus dungeon runs are largely done through pickup groups these days. And in a pickup group, it only takes one inconsiderate person to ruin it for everyone else. The second sort of aspect of all of this to really step back and consider, well, I guess third at this point, aspect of this to step back and consider is not just what would removing the timer incentivize players to do, but what would adding in the death-based system, how would players then respond to a death-based system similar to what we see in Delves, and how would that affect player behavior? It would certainly make them a lot more risk averse. Like a lot of things that right now are common in Mythic Plus, things like trying to make big pulls, trying to get as many trash packs together as possible, trying to chain CC and AoE everything down, that would become less common. And depending on your opinions, that may be a good thing or maybe a bad thing. I'm willing to just call that something subjective on whether that's a style of play that you like or not. But it would definitely cause that change where now those big pulls, well, that's unsafe. We might die if we do big pulls. So we should instead pull as few things as possible, especially, again, when you get into higher difficulties where the chance of a death on any given pack is higher and higher. You're going to want to take as few risks as possible, which means things are going to slow down tremendously. It would also mean that the overall like class meta would likely move towards in more favor of classes that are generally more survivable. They're generally more able to live through bad situations. So classes that don't have good defensive cooldowns or are just generally squishy, maybe they have less magic mitigation than other classes and so on. The classes that you generally meme about, like, oh, it's another pull, so they did a ton of damage, but then they fell over dead. The fell over dead now becomes the important part of that, and the did a ton of damage is no longer relevant really in this situation. So it would mean that we would have a much closer microscope put on specifically how each class is able to survive in these situations, which is it's an overcomable issue, but it would require a fair bit of class balance, in my opinion, to be able to get to a point where every class felt like they could still even attend a Mythic Plus run. And knowing how the WoW community tends to go, that would mean if your class is 2% more likely to die on a given pull, now you just don't get an invite to any group at all ever anymore, ever again, because who would invite a Windwalker monk? They die all the time. That's how dramatically the WoW community at large tends to blow even the smallest of balance distinctions out of whack, that would pretty much just be what that falls down to at that point. And this would happen at lower keys, because the people who do lower keys really love to think that they're Echo every single time they go into these dungeons. It actually is insane to me. But this would be the sort of thing that at all ranks of keys, you would be like, ugh, we're not going to bring insert class here because they die too much. Continuing along that line of thinking, it would also mean if you are in a Mythic Plus dungeon and you die, yes, right now you get kind of like, oh, this guy's dead again in the middle of your Mythic Plus dungeon, but it's something that you can sort of limp someone through in your dungeon. You can be like, okay, well, if it's just that one person and at least like it's something that we can recover from and so on. It's difficult in an environment where deaths is like you have that death counter and it's going down every single time this person dies. There's going to be a lot of extra blame and potentially a lot of extra toxicity levied towards people who are just having maybe they're just having a rough run. They're just dying over and over again in this one particular run. They're going to get a lot more crap than they might have otherwise. And both of these things that I just talked about, the extra blame being put on people who are dying, as well as the overall unwillingness and the adversity towards taking risks throughout the dungeon and doing anything that might be slightly dangerous as you're going through the dungeon. Both of these things are going to get worse and worse and worse as that death counter ticks down. You kind of have this right now with the timer, where as the timer is getting close to the end, people start getting a little crazy and it starts getting a little bit extra hectic because you're like, oh, we got to go. But at least there's like an imminent end to that. You can always go slower through a dungeon. You can always take extra time to explain things. You can always take extra time to sit and wait on cooldowns to come back up and so on. There are always these abilities to just make the, like, if it's literally just infinite time, there's no guaranteed end to this at any point, and you've got one death left on the timer, you're going to start doing some really, really obnoxious stuff to try and avoid losing that one remaining death. And that's especially if you really care about the potential rewards at the end of the dungeon. So that's, I don't know, just kind of an extra little like this. I feel like when the death system starts to really get down to the wire, player behavior is going to be skewed even worse than it currently does when the timer gets down to the wire. But of course, Delves have a system that's like this already, and it seems to work just fine in Delves. We don't really have a lot of complaints like this that are occurring inside of Delves. So if it works in Delves, surely it would work in Mythic Plus, right? Maybe, but there are two really important distinctions that I think are they're just very important to make when comparing Delves to Mythic Plus. The first is that Delves are primarily solo content. Yes, you can do them in a group, but I would be shocked if the majority of players are doing Delves in a group. I expect that it just seems very obvious to me that the vast majority of Delve players and the vast majority of times that you're going and doing a Delve, you're probably doing them solo the majority of the time, or the average player is probably doing them solo far more often than they're doing them in groups. It's really just kind of designed as solo content that you could bring some friends along to if you want, especially now that like a lot of the weird balance stuff has been fixed. The reason that's important is like a lot of those issues I just described kind of don't matter if you're the only one there. Like if you need to AFK because you're out of snacks and you're in the middle of a delve, you stick yourself someplace safe and you just go AFK, and that's fine. Like the only person that you're slowing down is you. So it's completely and totally fine. It's okay. If you decide you want to sit there and wait for cooldowns before you pull the next boss, again, you're the only one being inconvenienced by this. So it's just not as important. But secondly, and kind of on the note of that last thing I was just mentioning, Delves don't get nearly as sweaty as Mythic Plus does. Delves don't have nearly the upper levels of difficulty that Mythic Plus does. Like that, the highest Delves that you can do, yeah, they're challenging. Yeah, they can be difficult. But if you're just doing them for rewards or whatever, at the point where you're just doing these just to get your stuff done for the week and then move on, they're pretty easy comparatively. And it is worth noting that some of those issues that I was talking about that the timer prevents in Mythic Plus were things that were actually occurring in Delves very early on. It's just that the people that got super sweaty about Delves outpaced Delves and don't need to do that stuff anymore because Delves are now easy for those players. So if you take the Delve style system where there's no timer at all, it's just deaths, and you move that over into Mythic Plus, you do have to take into account those two, in my opinion, very important distinctions. You're now moving into exclusively group-based content, and you're now moving into content that can be pushed to a much higher degree of difficulty, where that knife's edge becomes much, much sharper. Kind of going back to something that I was mentioning earlier, if there is an obvious advantage to doing something and there's no clear disadvantage for doing it, then I'm just going to do the thing that gives me an advantage, even if it's boring, even if it makes me enjoy the content less, as long as the reason that I'm doing it is to get some better reward. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, World of Warcraft, like most MMORPGs, is about advancing your character, and it's about getting better gear, getting better stats, and so on and so forth, so that you can become more powerful inside of the game. And the more that I am able to do that, and as I'm just reaching and stretching and clawing for every last shred of player power that I can possibly get, as I'm reaching the upper echelons of content and the upper echelons of difficulty, I'm just going to start doing a lot of stuff that maybe it's not fun, but it's effective. So that's why I'm doing it. And I want to make sure I'm very clear about one thing. I'm not just talking about what is the most difficult content in the game. I'm talking about what's the most difficult content for me. What is as a player, at my skill level, at my ability level, at the place where I'm geared, the place where like the content that I am able to complete. I am always going to want to try to complete like whatever the next level of that up is, or at least look at it. And if doing that then results in me feeling like, okay, now I need to start doing this weird stuff to be able to progress through this thing. Like, it could be literally the difference between going from a mythic, like a +3 to a +4. It doesn't matter at the end of the day. If players feel like that's what's necessary to be able to push themselves to that next level, it's generally speaking what players are going to do. Or especially in a multiplayer environment like Mythic Plus, be pressured by other players into doing. That's just the nature of a social video game like an MMORPG. So then the question becomes, how can we mitigate and lessen some of the more negative potential side effects of a system like this being put in place? If we're going to go down the route of removing the Mythic Plus timer and implementing the Delve style death system instead, how can we make sure it doesn't get as bad as I've just been describing it? What are some things that can be done to prevent that from becoming a thing? One big one that I would like to see is keep some sort of like background fail-safe timer in place regardless. And it doesn't have to be something that's like ticking down on your screen constantly. It doesn't have to be like a constant presence. But if you've been in a Mythic Plus dungeon for 2 hours, that there should be some point where you've been in there so long that the game goes, okay, you probably shouldn't be here anymore. Like, there needs to be some sort of definitive end to this thing so that players don't feel the need to continue pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing themselves to tears. Personally, I would still like to see some kind of, I believe if they just doubled the current timers and added this death system, that would probably be enough. Give us like an hour and 15, hour and 20 minutes as like an absolute, okay, yeah, you should really not be in here anymore sort of timer, but keep something in place so that there is that eventuality of, you don't want to just be banging your head against a wall forever. Put something in there still that makes it so that there's that obvious and definitive end to the dungeon to prevent the worst case scenarios from occurring. And again, I don't think this is something that needs to be like ticking down on the side of the screen at any point. This should be something that a lot of players never even realize exists because they just aren't running into it. But just something that says, welcome to the dungeon. This will expire in 2 hours, just so that you know, like, okay, this is the amount of time that is ludicrous to have spent in this dungeon, but it's there to make sure that I don't accidentally spend all day in here. Another thought that I had for this is if they implemented some sort of, basically delves have like a checkpoint system where you reach these points and you regain some lives. I think something like that could help offset. And I'm assuming because Blizzard's already drawing distinctions to delves or comparisons to delves in their survey, I'm assuming that this is something that they already have in mind. But if the checkpoint system was put together in such a way where you start off with a relatively low number of lives, but can increase that by going through the dungeon effectively, that would help mitigate some of the other concerns of like, okay, well, we've been on one death this entire like we had a bad start and we've been on one death for this entire dungeon and we made it so far through it and then we had the last death and now we've wasted a bunch of time. Having it be something where as you reach certain points in the dungeon, maybe it's after defeating a boss, maybe it's at specific like geographical locations as you're getting through the dungeon, like, oh, you've reached this spot. Congratulations. You've now unlocked 2 extra deaths or whatever. having some sort of thing like that in place can help smooth out the overall curve of how difficult is this dungeon, and how it would make it easier for the dungeon to fail early on if you are just not supposed to be in there in the first place. And I think that would help. It would also give more of an opportunity to recover from a couple of bad pulls. Like if something just goes wrong, but not catastrophically so in like the first, I don't know, 5-10 minutes of the dungeon, you can then make the choice of, okay, that sucks, but let's keep going anyway. And as long as you play well through the rest of the dungeon, it gives you that bit of like recovery to be able to claw your way back into a successful run, which is something that genuinely right now doesn't really super exist. Like right now it's more of a like, okay, we're just behind and hopefully we can catch back up. Hopefully we still have time to complete it. But I feel like this would create a little bit more of a ability to feel like you're recovering throughout the dungeon, which I think I've said a couple times. So I'm just gonna move on and stop saying the same thing over and over again. Thinking about cooldowns and how to avoid the let's just sit around and wait until Bloodlust especially comes off of cooldown. Like Bloodlust is the one that I think would be the most problematic. It's not too big of a deal if someone's like, oh, can you give me 30 seconds so that Avenging Wrath or whatever can come off of cooldown? Like that's fine. That I'm less worried about. It's the ones that have really long timers where like you pop Bloodlust, you all immediately died, but now you're waiting the extra 5 to 10 minutes for Bloodlust to come back off of cooldown or for the debuff to wear off or what have you, so that you can use your Bloodlust again. I would like to see something done to help mitigate that issue a little bit. The idea that I had, and it's not really the most like dramatic idea. It's not the most, God, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not the most creative solution because it's literally just copy what happens with battle reses, copy what happens with combat reses. I'll give like a number of charges on Bloodlust and say you get these charges back. Maybe it can be tied into the checkpoint system I was just mentioning, or it can be something that is like, I don't know. The idea is basically you have one Bloodlust to use in this section of the dungeon. Use it at the time that is sensible that you choose inside that section of the dungeon. And then you can get back to one charge when you get to this point, basically. So that way it's less of a, let's just sit around waiting forever for Bloodlust. It's more of a, we have like we have this charge. We will use this charge of Bloodlust at a point that makes sense. And if we fail, then we don't have Bloodlust. And the only way to get Bloodlust back is to continue progressing through the dungeon anyway. So there's no incentive to sit around waiting. Another approach could be to literally just change how Bloodlust works in Mythic Plus dungeons. Just literally make it a smaller effect with a smaller cooldown. That would also potentially work. Just something needs to be done, in my opinion, to make sure that there is no incentive for, hey, here's this new boss, or here's this difficult boss that we're coming up to, but we are still on Bloodlust from whatever else. So let's wait. Or we got to this boss, we died, we still had enough deaths left so that we were able to get back to the boss. But now we're on Bloodlust cooldown, so we have to sit and wait 10 minutes before we pull the boss again. Some sort of something in place. They could even go back to like how it works in raids, where if there's no longer a timer, that could literally just be, did you die? Okay, sated is wiped, the cooldown of Bloodlust comes off again, go back in there and try again. Any of these options would work, but something would need to be done to try to reduce that incentive to sit around and wait for cooldowns to come up. Now, as far as things like people just being inconsiderate and AFKing, a lot of the stuff that really only comes into play as a problem in pure pugs, where there isn't really any social deterrent against being a jerk in this thing, because these are people you're never going to see again. There's no ongoing consequences if you're in a full pug and you decide to just AFK, because you're never going to group with any of those people again anyway. So why does it matter? There's some things that could be done. I think that's a tougher one to solve. I've seen a lot of suggestions over the years for like a community rating system or something like that that would be tied into the group finder, where you could be like, yes, I enjoyed playing with this person, give them a thumbs up. This person was a jerk, give them a thumbs down. And the problem inherently with systems like that, lots of video games have had systems like this to some degree of success. But the problem inherently with those is that humans are just bad at standardizing these sorts of things. Like, if you don't believe me, go look at Yelp reviews at some point. You'll go look at some restaurant and you'll see somebody who's listing like what is probably the worst dining experience you can imagine. It's just absolutely terrible, but they still gave 5 stars because they didn't want to be mean. You'll see that on Yelp, or vice versa. you'll see someone describing what is the best dining experience that you could imagine. Like, this actually sounds great. They must have had a fantastic time, but they gave 1 star because my server didn't smile enough or some such stupid nonsense. So those systems can work, but they tend to come with a lot of their own problems, and they're also generally pretty easily abused as well, especially in group content where you can all communicate with each other like that and be like, hey, this guy was a jerk, downvote him. Like, there are other issues that such a system would come with. So I'm not a big fan of the idea of implementing some sort of community rating system into the group finder. There's ways it could be done, like the way that like Overwatch does it, where it's all purely upvotes these days. Like, sure, but pure upvotes doesn't really, like, oh, I didn't get upvoted on this run is the same as most runs you're doing anyway. It's not really a consequence of being a jerk. So I don't know. I feel like some of those issues would just have to be things that the WoW community deals with in its own way in some capacity. And it could mean that there's more dungeon runs and more Mythic Plus runs that just die out because somebody decided they had to go wax their cat halfway through. And that's kind of the core of my point that I'm making with this video, is I don't necessarily think this distills down to would removing the timer, would moving to a death-based system, would either of these things be good or bad for the video game? And this is probably why Blizzard is putting this out in a survey now as well, is it's not really a yes or no question. It's not really a does this make the game better or worse, like full stop categorically across all opinions. It's more a question of how does it change things, and does the way that it changes things appeal to you more or less? And I genuinely believe that there's no incorrect conclusion there. You could easily say, yes, I still want the timer because that's the way that I want to keep playing the game. Or you could say, no, actually, this no timer system, I'm not as worried about some of those negative things. That just doesn't bother me as much. And the advantages of that system sound great, so I would rather have that. To me, it's genuinely something where there's just going to be differences of opinion, and it's largely subjective. It's not really a strong yes or no, one is better than the other. It's more a question of what do you as a player prefer to play? Me personally, I'm still leaning towards probably preferring the timer to be there. I think the negative aspect, like, I'm just kind of selfish in that sense. I don't want to sit around and wait because somebody's cat threw up on their feet again while they were doing Mythic Plus dungeons. I'm like, okay, yeah, that sucks, but I guess shake it off and let's get through the rest of this dungeon. I don't know. This is starting to get really gross, so I'm not going to continue that line of thinking right now. But I'm the sort of player who, when I join a pickup group, I want to get the thing done and I want to move on. And yes, that does mean that I don't have as much opportunity to like teach people how to get through stuff. Yes, it means that occasionally people get really, really antsy about going super fast. And then, like, even in cases where I start to fall behind, I'm feeling like I'm being yelled at. But there's enough that I prefer about the paradigm in which going fast is considered valuable, that I slightly lean that direction, but I can see some arguments to be made. And I don't know, I would be very interested to try a system and just see how it goes. See what Blizzard can come up with and see what they can do to try and make a death-based system with either no timer or a very lengthy, like, I still think that having some sort of timer in place, it's like, hey, you really shouldn't be here anymore, would probably be some sort of good fail-safe sort of thing. But either way, I'd be interested to try it. I would be interested to see what they can come up with. And I feel like there are ways to make it work. It's really just going to come down to the question of, does the complete package of player behavior with this change in place make it more or less fun, and for how many players? That's really what it boils down to. But I am starting to run out of words on that topic, so I'm just going to go ahead and move on to a couple of questions. We had a couple of great ones come in after last week's episode. We were talking about MMORPGs and the quote-unquote core MMO. And is that a genre that's dying out, or is that something that is continuing on? There were a lot of great comments on that episode, and a lot of stuff that gave me some extra food for thought. And this question from Neomagam also gives me a really good opportunity to address a bunch of that stuff. So I'm just going to go into this question. It says, I think diving further into this topic with why the MMORPG genre is less popular than it once was would be fascinating. As best I can tell, people still love big open world games such as Elden Ring, Breath of the Wild, etc. People still love quest-driven RPGs such as Baldur's Gate 3, Dragon Age, etc. And people still love the spectacle of community-driven events such as OnlyFans, Race to World First, etc. So why is it that people don't want to play MMORPGs anymore? Is it just because the existing ones are old, or is there something about the MMO, the interacting with strangers on the internet of it? So there's a few things that I want to dig into with this question. The first thing that I want to say is just to clarify, when I'm talking about the player base, I'm not talking about every single player. I'm not saying every single player holds this opinion, right? In the last episode, I talked a bunch about how the general player base, the general modern player base, the people who play MMORPGs nowadays have been trending more towards wanting more active combat. They've been trending more towards less excitement about action bars and tab targeting and so on, and more about being more directly immersed and more directly, again, just action combat, being more directly put inside of the shoes of their character. And that's how we see things like Destiny coming along. That's how we see things like more MMOs where the combat is actually like active targeting instead of tab targeting and so on. That's not me saying that every single MMO player wants that. And there were a few people who pointed out things like, well, it can't be that everyone wants active combat because Baldur's Gate 3 was super successful. Like, yes, you are correct. Turns out video games are subjective and people like different things. So I don't think there is a direct answer to why don't people want to play MMORPGs anymore? Because there are people who want to play MMORPGs still. There are still people who want to play these video games. I'm one of them. I still like to play games like that. And that's not directly a response to Neomagam's question here. That's more just I'm using it as an opportunity to get that thought out of my head. I think that part of it, which I did sort of discuss a little bit last week, is that a lot of those aspects, like Neomagam lists off a few things like big open worlds, lists off a few things like quest-driven RPGs and so on. These are things that you can find in a lot of different genres nowadays, whereas it used to be the quest-driven RPG thing, like those predate MMORPGs. Things like Baldur's Gate 1 was around before MMORPGs really were. Like, I think Ultima Online was kind of around back then, but it was a long time ago. I don't remember exactly when Baldur's Gate 1 came out. Either way, these are things that have existed since prior to that anyway. They go all the way back to games like Rogue a million years ago, games like Zelda and so on, where this is an RPG where you're going out and you're doing stuff. And yeah, there isn't necessarily a quest that you're doing for somebody, but you go and you get a task and then you go and complete that task. This is something that's existed for a long time. I'm getting off on a tangent. These are all things that can be experienced in different styles of video games. And what we've seen over the past decade or so is more and more things that used to be unique to the MMORPG. These used to be things that were only in games like EverQuest, like Anarchy Online, like Ultima Online, like Dark Age of Camelot, etc. These were things you only experienced in those games, have now spread to many, many, many different sorts of games. Then I would argue the entire concept of a battle pass is something that came about stemming out of people realizing, oh my God, the MMORPG and that drip feed dopamine aspect of getting a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more eventually led to that. I'm not saying that MMORPGs are directly to blame for battle passes being popular, but it's the same general line of thinking, that understanding from a gameplay design perspective, that if you have something that you can progress with, players tend to gravitate towards that a little bit more, and they tend to spend longer playing those sorts of games because just the way our brains are, we're feeling rewarded for doing so. And so we will continue playing it. And you can find that in all sorts of games these days. Again, it used to be something that was pretty unique to the MMORPG genre. And then I remember playing Call of Duty 4, the original Call of Duty 4, Modern Warfare, on my Xbox way back in the day, and going, oh, this is cool. As I play this game, I'm like leveling up, kind of like in an MMORPG. And getting that sort of feeling of I am now progressing. I am getting that dopamine drip of being able to progress through things. So part of it is literally a lot of the reasons that used to exclusively bring people towards MMORPGs are now available in lots of different video games. That's not really the genre dying. That's just, this is a good idea that people have started bring to more video games. Things like games being super open world and so on. Like, sure, yeah, that's as technology has advanced, much of it due to the existence and technology that was created to cause MMORPGs to be able to exist in the first place, we now have the ability to have these massive open worlds much more regularly, even in single player games. This is just something that's just the natural progression of video game technology and so on and so forth. And again, there were big open world games before MMORPGs existed too. I don't think it's a case that people don't want to play MMORPGs anymore. I think it's more just that is where that used to be the only way to get that sort of experience. Nowadays, you can get that in everything. You can get that in Rocket League nowadays by just unlocking things as you play games in Rocket League. So that to me is a big core of the answer to that question. And I do think there is something to the MMO aspect of it. There's people who just don't want it. Like if they're playing a video game, they don't necessarily want to be around a bunch of people, especially if your day job is spending time around a whole lot of people. You may want to get home and then just do something by yourself for a little bit. You may not want to go from your job working, I don't know, as a concierge at a hotel where you're talking to people constantly all day, every day, and then get on a video game and then continue talking to people constantly and having to interact with a bunch of people. Maybe you want to get home, crack open a bottle of wine and just sit back and chill and, I don't know, play Horizon or something. I don't know. Maybe that's some aspect of it as well. I'm sure there are people who otherwise would have put up with those social aspects in an MMORPG, even though they that wasn't really what they were there for. Who nowadays have that option in other video games. They can still get that sort of feeling of progression, that feeling of moving on. Blah blah blah. I'm just rambling at this point, but yeah, I think there is some element of that has made the interacting with strangers on the internet kind of fall out of favor. But then again, you're seeing that in so many other games that are popular nowadays too. So I don't think it's expressly that people don't want to play multiplayer games. I think it's just literally there's more options nowadays. And so the question is, with all of these options that are available, and the question that I was trying to put forth in last week's episode, with all of these different options now being available, is the core MMORPG, is the EverQuest style MMORPG still something that people want to see? And I think the answer to that is yes. And clearly from the responses to that video, the answer is yes. It's just a question of how big is that audience these days? And I guess we'll see, because there are still some MMORPGs on the way, and we'll see how well they're going to end up doing. Which is going to move me on to the last question for today, which came from Spotnik, who said, did you forget the Riot MMO on purpose? The one Ghostcrawler worked on for years and that they kind of decided to restart. So yeah, I didn't mention Riot's MMO in the last video. And part of that is I did genuinely just kind of forget about it for a minute. But the reason that I kind of forgot about it for a minute is because we just don't know anything about it at this point. We don't even know if it's still in development really at this point. Given the nature of how the gaming industry has been over the last couple of years, it would not surprise me in the slightest to learn that the majority of the people who were working on that team have quietly been moved to other teams inside of Riot, or I actually don't remember if Riot had some big layoff. I think they did have a big wave of layoffs a while back. So it's entirely possible that most of that team doesn't even exist anymore. I don't know. I genuinely don't know. The reality is, everything that I could possibly say about the Riot MMO as it exists currently is exactly what Spotnik said in this question. It was worked on by Ghostcrawler for a while. He's not there anymore. He went off to start Fantastic Pixel Castle. They're working on Ghost, which I did talk about in last week's episode. And that they've kind of decided to restart it. And I don't know what that means. I don't know if them restarting it means that it's still actively being developed. I don't know if it means that it went back to the planning stages. It's entirely possible that whatever that team, maybe there is still a team that's really focused on developing it, but it's entirely possible that as they were doing that, they decided, you know what, maybe MMORPG isn't what we're after. Maybe they played Lost Ark and they were like, ooh, top-down perspective. That's kind of like what we have in League of Legends already. Let's try to make a League of Legends MMO, essentially, in that sense. Or maybe they were like, you know what, Valorant's been popping off. Valorant's been doing well for us. Let's turn Valorant into what Titan was going to be for Blizzard back in the day. I don't know. There's so many different potential possibilities for what they're doing with, we've decided to start this all over again from scratch, that it's impossible to predict. So there just wasn't much to say about it, even if I hadn't slightly forgotten that it existed for a minute. Anyway, that's going to wrap us up for today. Thank you all so much for watching. Again, we do have a giveaway going on for the The name of the transmog that I totally can, Waveborn Diplomat's Regalia. I don't know why I cannot remember the name of that thing. It's probably because there've been so many words so many times over the years that it all kind of blends together. But anyway, the Waveborn Diplomat's Regalia, we're giving away 2 codes for anyone in the North America, South America, or Oceanic regions to be able to use. You can head over to my Discord. That's discord.gg/Devilor. Find the giveaways section in the drop down on the left over there, or in the category list on the left, and just click the little icon in there. The entries for that close at 9 p.m. Pacific on today, which is December 17th. So get in there quick if that's something you want to see. I'll also be live streaming, and we'll be giving away these. We'll be selecting the winners live. You don't have to be there live to be considered a winner, but we'll be selecting the winners live on my Twitch channel. That's twitch.tv/Devilor. You can check it out over there. Thank you so much to all my patrons, everyone that's been sticking it out. I know that I owe you guys a content planning video. I promise I'm gonna do that. It's just been an absolutely hectic last several of months for me. And it's just one of the things that keeps getting kind of brushed to the side, but I need to stop doing that. So I will get our patrons that content planning video very, very soon. We'll be talking a lot about the ideas of what we're doing going into 2025 and so on, what things mean for the channel, etc. And talking a bit about how this last year has gone. I want to take the opportunity to get a little candid with it, since we'll just be talking to my patrons. So thank you all again so much for being there. The support really does mean a lot, and it helps keep this channel going. You can also check out my merch store. That's at devilor.com. Discord, like I said earlier, discord.gg/Devilor. And I think I'm done talking now. I think I'm done. For real this time. No, these are the last words I'm going to say in this episode.